is this year also, to remind you, the 125th birth anniversary of P.C. Mahalanobis, our founder. So I'm very happy to introduce Thomas Sterner, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Thomas is one of the giants of environmental economics, perhaps not so well known to this development audience. So I'll just say a few words. Thomas's early work on gasoline demand elasticities is very well known, which he showed that although short-run elasticities are quite low, long-run elasticities are actually quite high, and the implications for this, of course, for climate policy are really quite important. Then he went on to do early work on integrated assessment models, in which he showed that the common practice of using discount rates to, which sort of means that you value damages coming in the future lower, that there's a kind of inconsistency in the way we do this, because that discounting is coming partly from the fact that people in the future will be richer, and therefore the marginal utility of consumption will be lower, so we should value that less. That's part of the reason why we discount. But in that case, to be consistent, if you are going to do that with regard to future people and value their consumption less because they're richer, then you should also worry about present people whose consumption is lower, right? And then in that case, you can't value their 1 unit of their consumption at the same level as the unit of consumption of someone in a richer country. Anyway, this is a very well-known, highly cited paper with Christian Aza that looked at discounting and distributional considerations in global warming. And then a few years ago, he has a very beautiful paper with Michael Huell, again looking at the discounting problem, and this time pointing out that using the one sector growth model, which is kind of standard in the literature, is actually abstracting away from something very important, which is that the relative price of environmental goods will rise as environmental goods get relatively scarce as time goes on, and that has a very important implication for how you discount. So more recently, he's been doing a great deal of interdisciplinary work published in journals like Nature and Science with natural scientists. And he's also very well known for his textbook on policy instruments for environmental and natural resource management. And he's one of the people who has basically taken environmental economics in developing countries and development problems really seriously, and made great contributions to that field. So I think I'm really happy to welcome him here at our conference. Thomas.
Thanks. Thank you, Sam. It's great to be here, and I'm sad that cricket in Delhi these days has its health risks. I was reading that it's quite dangerous to do too much exercise with the particles, and I feel kind of at home in the sort of the haze you have in Delhi, because this photo was actually taken when I was young in London, where I grew up. You can see it's kind of the same color. So starting with local pollution here. In the 50s, it was the British cricketers who had this disadvantage of training with too much smog, and today it's the Indian ones. So this is an overview of the talk. I'll be speaking about climate change and the environment. I'll quickly try to give an introduction a little bit to the problem. Then I'll connect to Stiglitz's Plennary, which I enjoyed so much. In fact, both the first day's plenaries were a great excitement. Then I'll talk about the price on carbon, climate negotiations and fairness, the Paris Agreement, and then technology and green finance. And I want to start by talking about inertia. This is a picture of an oil tanker, and it's one of the largest. And so in a way, it's kind of symbolic to have an oil tanker here because fossil fuels are a little bit at the heart of this problem. And this, having been one of the biggest tankers ever on the seas, it was recently beached in India, driven up on a beach and taken to pieces with people with very little equipment and very little protection for themselves and the environment, which is a scandal in itself. But none of that is all interesting, but none of that was, nor the fact that it's an oil. I just wanted to show you this image because it's an image of inertia. And I happen to have a friend, a young guy, who is trained to be a captain of one of these ships. And when he tells me the favorite sports, which is drinking amongst captains, it makes me worried. He's a very heavy drinker himself. I've saved him at my parties a number of times. And so he tells me that in an emergency, you know, there's an emergency with your car, you slam on the brakes and you kind of, you know, there's the second split feeling and you hope you brake in time. The fastest braking to stop this vessel is 1 hour and 5 miles. So you slam your motors full throttle backwards, and then you wait on the bridge for an hour, and you will hit an object that is closer than 5 miles. That's a feeling of inertia. But climate change is a problem that has an inertia of hundreds of years. And to explain that, I'll go into a little bit of carbon dioxide. Now, you know how much carbon dioxide there is in this room? Before you guys came in, it was 400 parts per million. That's about a half of a tenth of 1%. Right? When we finish, if I keep some excitement in here, we will have got to about 1,000 parts per million. But then that will be, you know, ventilated out into the atmosphere. So it was December the 16th, that's, what is that, 2 days ago or something? It was 407.08, measured by a guy called Keeling, who some 40, 50 years ago had the great idea as a postdoc to set up an observatorium on a mountain, and he's become well famous, and it is covering this day by day. So this is 1 year. In the summer, there is decomposition. In the winter, there is in the north. There's more landmass in the north. There's more decomposition, therefore, globally in the north, and you get carbon dioxide coming into the atmosphere. And then in the northern summer, there is plants growing and sucking carbon dioxide out. So you get this sort of yearly pattern, which you can also see here on a 60-year scale. And you can see this sort of movement, yearly movement, but there's a very strong trend. And since not my lifetime, well, this is roughly my lifetime, right? But just my children's lifetime, we've had an increase of 60 parts per million. Now, it's hard, if you haven't studied the issue, to know if 60 parts per million is a lot or not. But we can see that in this diagram. And, you know, economists joke, well, all these jokes about being dead in the long run, and what is the long run, and if it's 5 years or 10 years. Well, this is definitely long run, right? It's the most long run figure not the most long run figure in this lecture, but the most long run figure you generally see in economics, because it's 400,000 years. And I met the guy who had the idea, a French guy, glaciologist, who spent his whole life basically holed up with one other guy in Antarctic. And he had this idea. On one occasion, they were Claude Lurius is his name. He comes from Grenoble. And usually they'd be, every summer they would get home, the plane would arrive. When he was young, it was a ship. When he was older, it was a plane. 1 year, the plane didn't come. So, you know, I had to stay with the same supplies 1 more year. And the second year, the plane did come. And they were going to celebrate. And one of the, postdoc took a piece of the precious research ice and put it into the last bottle of whiskey. And Claude saw these bubbles come out. And he said, how old are those bubbles? Maybe I could analyze them. Because they were collecting the ice for other purposes. They were looking at radioactivity from the tests. And that's how the idea was born. Maybe Claude is dramatizing this a little bit extra, I don't know. But anyway, so then he started analyzing the carbon dioxide content in these bubbles at different depths. And so you could date it by the depth and produce this kind of curve. You can see that when we have an ice age, the carbon content of the atmosphere is about 180 parts per million. When we have the interglacial period, so this is even Indian civilization is just the thickness of a line here, right? This is a period here. Right? The period when human civilization has developed. And this period has been unusually stable here, and we call it the Holocene. Right. Now, it is more difficult, but there are other methods to reconstruct and gauge the carbon content of the atmosphere for longer periods. Because you notice in this figure, we've never had anything like 400 parts per million before. It's completely outside the charts. Not outside the charts of the whole experience of the world, however. Before there were humans, so this is the previous diagram, compressed here. Back 4 million years ago, we have had 400 parts per million before. And 16 million years ago, here we have even more. But 4 million years ago, the sea level was 25 meters higher than it is today. That is the best estimate of what will happen now with the carbon content we have too. But it's not going to happen tomorrow. It'll probably happen in 200, 300 years. And now, I've seen the last 10 years, I've actually seen people start putting in 2100, start thinking 1 century. But no economist, no model thinks of what's going to happen after the year 2100. But the sea level is going to rise, and Bangladesh is going to disappear, and large parts of Calcutta and as well. Speaking of really serious things, we can't go skiing in Sweden anymore. This used to be the only resource Sweden had that was free and fun was snow. Now we don't even have that. So this is indoor skiing. We build this thing, and we make it cold, and we have artificial snow, and my son and others can go skiing indoors. It's pathetic. And it's also a feedback effect, because this whole thing requires a lot of energy, so we'll be speeding up the... right? Speaking of more serious things, in hot countries, we're getting these heat waves that are... And I'm going to explain the seriousness of this. A lot of people, particularly in the US, like in New York, Washington, the east coast of the continent, you get a lot of fluctuations in temperature. My American friends always say 2 degrees, like we have that change in 15 minutes in New York. But you can sort of watch the temperature go up and down. It's very hysterical weather there. But first of all, 2 degrees that everybody is speaking about, that is global mean surface temperature. And most of the globe is water, right? So this diagram is in degrees per degree, so it's a strange thing. But it is the number of degrees. If you had 1 degree global average, you'd have about half a degree over the Pacific and Atlantic. And you'd have about 1.5 in India, Africa, and a lot of other places that are already warm. Now, we're not going for 2 degrees. We're currently on a path towards 3.5 to 4. That would mean 6 degrees in India. And now we're not speaking of hundreds of years, right? We're speaking of this century. So when the young people here are getting old, it will be 6 degrees warmer in India. And well, I don't have to tell you what that implies. It's sometimes unbearably hot already. we're seeing forest fires in many countries, like California and Australia. Even the nuclear power plants, which some people think would be a great solution, they don't work when it gets too hot because the cooling water is not cool enough. The rivers dry up. And who here has seen coral reefs? Well, the rest of you, you better hurry up and see them. It is the most beautiful thing I know. And you don't need all the fancy equipment. If you've got a good reef, a snorkel is enough, and goggles. It is so beautiful. And well, the best articles currently published in Science and Nature, they estimate that practically all of it will disappear with 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, which is our highest hope, dream, right? That's our goal. So our goal includes the destruction of the coral reefs. Now, we've had a lot of trouble as a profession in estimating the costs of climate change, and some was referring to work on discounting. I have done a lot of work on discounting. Discounting is great fun. It's an important subject, and it's also very mathematical, and so you can do a lot of nice formulas. But that's about how we should, if we have a cost of a gazillion in 50 years or 100 years, how much is it worth today? But actually valuing that gazillion over there, what is the cost of climate change in 100 years or in 50 years, there's been very little work on that. Right? So, but there's new work is coming on this. This is a great paper by Burke and others who have tried to estimate it one way by looking at incomes in different countries, different temperatures, and it shows rather strong effects on income growth. So basically, we may not become, perhaps, as much better off as we hope because of climate change. Some, and Rohini have done work here in India showing, if I don't correct me if I get this wrong, but basically showing that on the hot days, you have increasing absenteeism, you have decreasing output. Not like Indian workers are shirking, right? They are paid by the piece and they need the income. But when it gets too hot, physiology kicks in and you can't produce, you can't operate. And this happens in all kinds of industries. Now, I want to connect this to Stiglitz talk. I hope you all heard Joe's fantastic presentation here. He's drawing up a world where machines are making machines. Right? This is what artificial intelligence is, this explosion. If the machines make machines and they get better and better at it, that process might ultimately be very rapid. Some people worry that there'll be this sort of takeover by machines and robots. And so, of course, they could produce, let's hope they want to, but we don't know what they want to do, but they could produce more and more. On the other hand, this does seem intimately tied. I mean, this is really the rewards to technology are the crucial element here. And the owner of that technology will be making most of the income. Profits will be mushrooming. We've kind of already seen this in the last 20 years. The share of income going to the 1% is increasing. And this is also connected to a number of ideas, right? A number of ideas that we could get excited by or worried by. The end of scarcity, which of course is a hope for humanity, for those who are poor. On the other hand, if the 1% are going to get all of it, which has actually happened in the US in the last 20 years or so, virtually the whole increase in GDP has gone to the 1% richest. This means that growth is actually not in the public interest anymore. it's in the interest of the 1%. And you are seeing these movements, like I lived in New York a year and a half recently, and it just started. I had this little apartment in Wall Street, looking down on the demonstrators. And, well, I should say there were very few demonstrators compared to the policemen who were there. So it's also connected to the idea of universal basic income, because, I mean, if the system is not going to burst from social unrest, you know, you might as well give everybody a little bit of income here. But there's also the question of land that Steve has raised, because of course there's a whole production function there, and some of the increased productivity is due to, there are some factors that are scarce, and that's really what I want to focus the rest of my talk on, which we economists abstractly call land. Right? But what is it? Right? Notice this guy. There is still a steering wheel, but that's just for nostalgia, right? Because it's not used anymore. So is this the vision of the future? A vision where all the taxi drivers will be unemployed, and or the accountants too, and we'll all just enjoy eating hamburgers, getting fatter, and being driven around by robots. Or, well, I mean, tell this to the poor who are still working 12 hours a day and trying to make ends meet, and it seems unrealistic, right? Even the physicians, it seems, can be replaced. Or, I mean, we could also be worse off in the future. The number of bees in the world has decreased dramatically. And that's just, there are actually 200,000 species of bee, it seems, but most of them are going down, notably the honeybee, which is one of the ones we monitor. And, well, fish stocks and other ecosystem attributes are falling, right? This could one day make us worse off instead. So all this is something we economists call land, but I want to talk more about the details of this land, right? Because it's the whole of the physical support to our globe, all aspects of it. And I have a friend who writes about this and calls the current era after the Holocene, which is the last, several 100,000 years when humanity has evolved, we may be entering the Anthropocene. Who's heard the word Anthropocene? Right, a few of you. I think it's a clever little word. It does sound like a geological era. They always have this like scene at the end, like Pliocene and so on. Those of you who studied geology, I haven't, so I admit. But anyway, Anthropocene is obviously the geological period when the fate of Earth is mainly decided by man. Well, otherwise, I mean, the temperature on Earth and other things, the parameters of the globe are decided by all kinds of small variations in our distance to the sun and wobbling in the orbits of the planet and other things that decide the temperature, the Milankovitch cycles and other things that decide long changes in climate, like the ice ages and so on. But today, the main driving force is man himself, or herself. Not all the blame on men. Now, my friend Johan Rockström, I borrowed this diagram. He has 100 diagrams like this. And I just replaced them like this. So this is not just primary energy use, but just about any indicator you can look at the use of various minerals, our emissions of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not the only gas. We've got methane, we've got nitrogen oxide, we've got CFCs, we've got other gases. Our population, our water use, the building of dams, urbanization, fertilizer use, fish, everything. All diagrams kind of look like this. There's this dramatic escalation, basically, after the Second World War. So we are moving earth, cement, carbon dioxide, and other things in enormous. We are using many of these aspects of land, as we economists call it. And think of this as, as linear programming. We are beginning to bump against a number of restrictions. And some group of geoscientists are calling this the planetary boundaries. And there's a number of planetary boundaries here, notably climate change. That is the ability of the climate to absorb carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases, and give us the kind of temperature that man is used to and likes. It's also the acidification of the oceans. Now, I worked and looked at acidification of lakes. A small lake can get acidified quite quickly. This happened in Sweden. In fact, Sweden is the country where acidification was discovered, kind of, because we found our fish were dying. And it turned out it was due to the burning of coal in Europe and England. Europe and England being two different things, you know that. Biodiversity, Europe is this little thing just south of the British Channel. Biodiversity, we're in the middle. There have, in the historic record, scientists have found 5 giant extinctions. The last one was 65 million years ago or something, when an enormous number of dinosaurs and species disappeared. We're in the middle of the 6th giant. We're losing species at a rate that is unparalleled in history before. We're also spreading new kinds of chemicals around. And I work a little bit on that. Some of the chemicals in plastics, for instance. The chemicals that give plastic this nice, soft, water-resisting, oil-resisting properties that we appreciate, they are chemically very, very, very close to estrogen and other compounds that regulate our sort of reproduction and sexual functions and stuff. Well, we got the emissions. We have the ozone problem. We have the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. We have all kinds. We have aerosols in the atmosphere. All kinds of things. I should go a little bit faster here, really. But now let's talk about climate change. There are 2 ways. As an economist, there's 2 ways you think, well, we could deal with climate change. Either we'd have to have an abatement plan, that is a plan, every country, how much you emit, how much you reduce, how fast. Or we could perhaps have just a generalized price on carbon. That's kind of the favorite for economists. These are the 2 first ideas that an economist comes to think of. Now, not only is the world in great jeopardy, but the reputation of our profession, too, which is more serious for many of us, right? Because the idea of a general price on carbon is not really well received. People are not picking up on this idea. So we have to reflect, are we right? Is this the best recipe? I've been thinking a lot about that, and teaching on this subject and stuff. And I am kind of convinced that, but one has to think carefully about this, right? So is there a laser pointer? But if there's heterogeneity in abatement cost, that is, if the abatement is much cheaper in one place than in another place, that's one of the fundamental conditions for when you want to use the market mechanism. If abatement cost is exactly the same shape in all places, it doesn't really matter who abates. The cost could be the same. Right? So you could just tell everybody to cut their abatement their emissions in half, or by 80%, and you'd have a reasonably cost-efficient plan. But if we have heterogeneity in abatement costs, then the market principle is very important. We can save a lot of money. This is really a basic idea, specialization. This is the heart of economics. So question is, before we go and give advice to the Minister of Economics, Finance, and say really have to have a price on carbon, we have to be sure, are abatement costs are they heterogeneous? And well, I don't know if anybody of you knows, But we can say that the activities that give rise to climate change, they include cows burping, and so indirectly people eating meat, which I know is a special issue to talk about anyway in India. Or people driving cars and airplanes, people making steel, and people growing rice, people burning forests. Lots of different activities in low-income countries and high-income countries. So it's likely that the abatement costs are going to be very different because there's lots of different activities in different places. If there are links to other sectors, so we don't just care about the technology of production of meat and production of electricity and production of rice, but also about the quantities of these consumed and the general equilibrium effects, well then again, a price is important because it gives signals to the whole economy. Well, I'm convinced that we would save a lot if we had a price on carbon, right? And actually, Sam and I spent some time at the IPCC, and we had friends there who love to draw these maps and get quite excited. It's like children coloring these. Nah, that was perhaps a bit below the belt. But I worry. So it's always fun to see more and more colors on a map. But most countries that say they have some kind of a price on carbon have a pitifully low price on carbon, and it really doesn't matter. Right? So most of these things are, this shows you. And here I'm very proud to be a Swede, otherwise I'm not very chauvinistic, but we have the highest price of carbon in the world. And most of the others here are just for show. In fact, this is to show you, if we were serious about climate change, and this is one of the biggest problems on Earth, then the policy instruments would dominate the price of oil. Because when a steel manufacturer is going to buy coal or oil or something, he has to pay for the fossil fuel first, and then the price on carbon on top, right? Well, here's the price of oil since 1860 in real terms, in yellow here. In blue terms is the nominal price. I see basically it's been falling in real terms until the oil crisis of the 70s and then more recently. And the very tough climate policies we have, can you see them? Right, they're down there. This is right, so to the price of oil, you actually have to add the price of the permits on the European trading scheme or the California markets or something else. So the price is not here, it's here, because you add that minuscule amount. Right, this is just to drive home the point that our climate policies so far are completely insignificant compared to the variations in the oil price. If you're an aluminium smelter somewhere and you're worried about which technology to use, you'll be looking at the oil price and the energy prices. You won't be watching these carbon permits very closely. A Swedish carbon dioxide tax started here and is currently here, so that is actually a little bit more of a sizable price. And otherwise, the European gas taxes, they are actually above this. They're up here. Right? So they're quite high. And in my view, the European gas tax is just about the only policy that has had any real effect on the carbon content of the atmosphere. It would be more than 407 today. Right? By the way, now it's about 650 in here. You can feel it. No, I can't. So do carbon prices have any effect? Well, that's hard to say, but this is a little bit of anecdotal evidence. Sweden had one of the lowest carbon intensities in the world, and yet it has fallen fastest over the last 30 years. This is another piece of anecdotal evidence. It's heating sector in Sweden. We have sort of collective heating, district heating. It used to be fired by oil. It's nowadays fired by wood, which we call biofuel. Sounds more modern. This is another piece of anecdotal evidence. There's a little bit about the gas taxes here. So the gasoline is cheapest in the US. That's the nicest country to live in if you have a big car. Okay? And it's most expensive in Europe. And the gasoline consumption per capita is very much lower. It's amazing. That's a case where we economists can feel good about ourselves. Expensive, you use less. Okay? It really works, economics. This is a linear scale here, but not some kind of funny scale. Right. Now I want to talk about fairness. So far I've said that we should have had a price, and we haven't, and that prices do work if we have them. The difficulty is to get them in place, right? So some 10 years ago, we had this meeting in Copenhagen, which was temporarily called Copenhagen, and it was a fantastic meeting. I remember speaking to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who had a sort of improvised meeting in a square in Copenhagen, and he was full of hope, and everybody was, there was a wonderful moment when it was a very ambitious climate plan that was being announced, and various continents, so Europe, for instance, was promising to reduce by 20%. And in fact, they said, well, actually, we'll do 20% anyway, and we'll do 30% if other countries also step up and do their share. This was a conditional kind of bid to get the, I think a clever idea, but it didn't work, but, to get the negotiations. Right. Japan said they'd do 25%. The US said they'd do somewhere between 14 and 17. They were cheating with the baselines. They had 2005 as a baseline instead of 1990. So their bid was really between 0 and 2 or something. But and then people would sort of look at India and say, what do you got to do? And so the US and India are, in this case, the two polar countries for this reason. Here, you can see here, this is emissions per capita in the US, and this is emissions per capita in India. The world is very unequal, as I'm sure you know. And it's particularly striking when it comes to carbon emissions. Right? With now Europe and China has grown since this diagram was drawn, and Europe has gone down a bit. So Europe and China are fairly much in the middle here at the average, and the US is very extreme on one hand, and India, Africa on the other hand. So go back to this. So suppose the world just consisted of two countries. That makes things easier: the US and India. Current emissions in gazillions of, I think, gigatons or something of carbon dioxide in the US are 5,600, and in India 2,400, rounded a little bit, so we'll get a total of 8,000. That's the world. The world. Now suppose we want to cut the world emissions in half by 2050 or something. That would be 4,000. There are various ways of doing this, which is the burden sharing. We could do what the Americans always do, which is called grandfathering, or percentage reductions. That's the percentage reduction game. Well, we'll do 50% reduction, you do 50% reduction. The whole world needs to do 50% reduction. So then the US would go down half of 5,600, 2,800, right, so on. The other way would, one other polar way would be to say that there's an entitlement. Every person on Earth should have the same share of the emissions space. And there'll be an emission of a certain number of kilos per person per day. And there's more capita in India than in the US. So if you do that allocation, then India would get to increase much less than it plans to increase, but still just from 2,400 just to 3,200. And the US would go down not from 5,600 to 2,800, but to nothing, virtually. Now, I love doing this, and we don't have that much time, but to get you to vote which of these schemes you think is fairest. Who votes for grandfathering as the... This is quick. And who votes for per capita? Let's see some exercise. We need. It's good for thinking. Okay, I've done this in lots of countries, a little bit slower. And Swedes typically also go for per capita. I don't know if that's because environmental economic students are particularly nice or whatever, but they tend to... Well, there'll be a bit of a distribution, but most choose that. I've done this in the US, and everybody selects grandfathering. And that's to say, I'm not speaking to the Republicans in Alabama or the oil industry, right? I'm talking to environmental economists in New York, DC, and other liberal places. They think this is fair. And they can be quite assertive about this and say, Thomas, you're being stupid. You can give up this somewhat socialist part of your lecture and say, do you want to save the world? They will ask me. Well, as long as we have this one, it's a good choice there. So be serious, Thomas. Suppose we manage. I work for the Environmental Defense Fund. They have hundreds of people who spend all their time talking and trying to persuade senators and congressmen. You know, suppose we once more get the climate bill on the floor of the Senate and on Congress. I mean, this is very unlikely. Suppose we could get them to vote for anything sensible, including a radical climate plan like cutting emissions in half. Do you want to ruin this one chance of getting a US climate policy by insisting on not only getting them to vote about climate, but also about global fairness on the same day? You know who these people are in the US Senate? They're going to vote no. And without the US having a climate policy, will there be any global climate policy? No. This is our one chance. So the world is kind of evil, and we have to choose between an unfair, unjust climate policy and no climate policy. And that's going to hit India even worse. Copenhagen failed. Now I told you my belief of why. There's a lot of money on the table. The cost of climate change is not actually quite as astronomical. Some people perhaps have an exaggerated view of it, so that's part of the problem. But still, there is a cost. A lot of solar power and wind power has to be built, and a lot of coal plants scrapped, and this is costly. And you have to insulate a lot of houses and do other things. It's costly. And so how we share those costs matter. And if there's a lot of money on the table, you know, what do you do when you're going to buy a rug in India and go to the shop? Maybe you can help me. And so you say, I'd like to pay 1,000, and then the shopkeeper says, well, no, it costs 2,000. No, you sit down and you have tea and you talk, and then you end up paying 1,800 or something, much closer to the seller's bid, right? At least that's what happens to me, hasn't it? I suppose you go in and you're kind of thinking you want to pay 1,000, and the shop owner says it costs 950,000. Then what do you do? Walk out. Yeah. That's what happened in Copenhagen. It's sad. This is a serious problem. And politicians walked out. Now, the French, I was living in Paris when this happened. The French analysis is that this was due to the greater diplomatic skills of the Frenchmen. They had better food at the conference facilities, and they were like more smooth connections with African leaders and whatever. Well, maybe that's part of it. They, they think it was a great success. But on the other hand, this is a treaty that says something radical. It says we're going to go down way below 2 degrees. That is, stay below an increase of 2 degrees above historical, getting as close to possible as 1.5. Most people think this is virtually impossible, 1.5. It basically means stopping and turn off the lights again. Right? Okay. It's a bit like a New Year's resolution. Do you have New Year's resolutions in India? And in the US, they have them and say, I'm going to lose another 100 pounds. I'm getting too fat. And then that's it. You just make a resolution. So I'm not going to go up by, But there's no instrument. Who is going to reduce emissions? And there's nothing about, there's no price of carbon. So all the economists, Nordhaus, Weizmann, Tirol, who just got the prize. In fact, Tirol and others, they wrote a letter saying the most important thing is the price on carbon. And he asked me to sign, oh dear. But that was, oh yes, right, okay. Well, right. Well, if a Nobel Prize winner asks you to sign a document saying something rather obvious, it's a no-brainer, right? So I signed it, but then all my friends besieged me to unsign the letter. And Tirol was not invited to Paris, right? No economists were present. And the French negotiating team said that if the word price of carbon, or carbon tax had been in there, the document would not have been signed, and the result of the Paris Agreement would have been the same as the result of the Copenhagen Agreement. We would have had no agreement. Now, would that have mattered? That was actually, this is like the third out of 4 parts in my talk, so I'll have to go fast through this one. I've written a paper on this. Does it matter if the Paris Agreement happened or not? Did it actually do anything? And we thought we'd look at this. You can't just look at, this is last 5 years of coal prices. In the last 5 years, they've gone down. And then when the Paris negotiation happened, you can't really see anything on a diagram like this. So we have done a financial event analysis, and we use lots of exciting methodology. But I won't have time to talk about that, maybe in the questions. If you ask about the exciting methodology, I'll get back to that. Anyway, the exciting methodology allows you to put in dummies in your regression for every single day, which sounds impossible because you think you'd run out of degrees of freedom, but you don't. So there's a trick to this. And you identify days when there's an exceptional return to capital and whatever. And we find, yes, there was a bit of an effect. The Paris Agreement, the solar prices went up a little bit and coal prices went down a little bit. Practically nothing. The effect, it's hard to find a significant effect, and it's very small. So maybe this is because in an event analysis, for an event to have an effect on financial returns, it has to be both surprising and strong. And so maybe the Paris Agreement, either it wasn't surprising enough or it wasn't strong enough. Then the most unlikely thing happened. Can you imagine who they elected to be president in the United States? So we looked at the election of Trump. That was unexpected, and he is great for coal, right? And fossil fuels. Again, not much of an effect. Well, there is a bit of an effect. Renewables fall a bit when Trump gets elected, and oil goes up a bit. Coal doesn't. That's a little bit strange. It indicates that maybe the long-run changes, but basically, sorry, to summarize this, Copenhagen and fairness didn't work, out the window. Prices and taxes don't work, except in Sweden. Paris didn't have much of an effect. What's the an appropriate view of the future.
Start planning for mitigation.
Yeah. Well, my view, this is supposed to be black, isn't it? With a good projector, the whole screen looks black. It's too much light in here. So my view of the future here is a little black. Now, joking, one of the few things that is positive is renewables. They're growing, doubling every 18 months, that kind of thing. It's fantastic. And the prices are coming down. And the more the prices come, the more down, the more they build. This is solar. This is an old military air base in Germany. It's no solar plant. And solar roofs everywhere, not 1,000, 10,000, which they planned for originally, like millions in Germany. This is a plant in India. In Bangladesh, there's a solar roof installed every minute. Solar bids are now within the range, and sometimes below the range, of coal-fired plants in many places. So, is the problem solved? Well, the best we can say is there's a proof of concept, right? Because this is oil use, this is coal use, it's come down a bit, but it's largely due to an increase in natural gas, actually. This is renewables down here. Right? It is rising fast. Well, there's a ways to go. So there's a bit of a proof of concept, but there's a lot to build. So now, I was just in Paris, and the Macron put on a great show, and all the attention was on finance. Bloomberg was there, and Gates, and all these rich people. And so there's a lot of attention on green finance. And again, taking these local examples of mine, but Gothenburg, the town I come from, was the first town that emitted a green bond. And that was something like it was $70, $80 million, and created lots of local excitement anyway. And pride, the first city to have a green bond. Now France is the first country to have a green bond, and they've created this bond of 10 billion euros. And again, I'm proud and excited because the finance ministry in France put me in a committee of 7 people to have some kind of oversight, because they say it's very important that we have careful oversight, transparency, that we show the world how to do green bonds properly and so on. So we're going to choose Thomas Turner to check that everything is right. Okay, right, that's a bit of a responsibility. I've never seen so much money before, right, 10 billion euros. But actually, renewable investments is not counted in billions. It's counted in many trillions. 10 billion euros isn't a lot of money if you're going to cover the world's roofs in solar cells. Green bonds are, furthermore, not cheaper than others. The French finance ministry are very proud to say that it's not costing more than a conventional bond. So that makes you feel kind of useless if you're an ecologist. It's not more expensive. I was hoping it would be cheaper, that the finances of the world would want to buy this bond because they're feeling green. No, they don't care. They just look at the return. And so they think that France is creditworthy. They don't really care about the green part. Right? That's the truth. The same thing with the disinvestment thing. If you boycott, we used to boycott South Africa when I was young because of apartheid. And then if 20% of the consumers don't eat South African oranges, they lose 25% of the market. If 25% of people don't buy South African stocks, then what happens? Nothing. Yeah, exactly. Right. So there's a problem with financial markets, that you only need a few guys to invest for them to get money, right? So I was saying before that fairness didn't work, pricing didn't work, Paris didn't work, and now I'm doubtful, whether technology will be enough and whether green finance will work. So I don't want this to be all too depressing. I thought I'd also echo Dixit who was speaking about corruption and how to fight corruption, and he said there's no golden bullet, there's no, you can muddle through and some things work a little bit, and that's good, that's the best we can do. So maybe here, technology is in fact working. I mean, the problem is that there's technological progress in fossil fuels too. Fracking is great technological progress. I mean, it's not very nice if you're close to it, but it is clever that you can drill in funny lines underground and make little controlled explosions in the holes and things. It's clever, right? And it's brought down the price of gas, which is why coal consumption has gone down, right? The trouble is that, by the way, that if the gas leaks out, just 1% of it, then gas is worse than coal, because methane is such a powerful climate gas, but we'll speak about that another time. Anyway, I still think that there is a crack in everything, as Leonard Cohen sang in one of his last songs. That's where the sun comes in. So, renewables are a hope. They are as cheap as coal, roughly. There's still, they don't really need, well, now this is difficult, right, if they need support or not. But actually they need support in another way, right? There's the whole legal system, the whole finance model, business model, the whole tariff construction, all this is designed for big centralized coal plants. And switching over to distributed renewables does require some legal changes and things, basically removing roadblocks to renewables. That's very important. We still need, green finance is still helpful. Other non-government agents, and lots of mayors around the world and businesses saying that they want to do things. I think ultimately one day we probably will have a carbon price. It's probably when coal is down on the floor, as I'd say in a boxing match, when they're already half dead, because basically what decides policy is not optimal policy design. It's not like the ministry calls geeks like me and asks what's the optimal policy design. Real policy making, I hope you know, is made by those who have most money. Most of politics, many governments are corrupt and are bought by politicians. It's rather obvious in the US case at the moment, right? So policy making is decided by who has most money. And so the building of a green lobby and the weakening of a brown lobby is important. And there's a whole sort of timing to policy design. We have to start with where we can make some progress, which might be in technology. This would strengthen the green lobby and weaken the brown lobby, and ultimately maybe make pricing. I have a picture here. This is green tea. It's the green part of the Tea Party movement in the US. Calls themselves green tea. Well, there are people in Florida and Texas who have oil wells, and then they also have solar power, and and then they can cut the power lines and say fuck you to the establishment and the power companies and everything. Anyway, you are welcome to come to Gothenburg. There will be a World Conference of Environmental Economics that I'm hosting and working on, and it will be 25th to 29th of June. We can continue the conversation. Thank you.
So we have time for questions.
Thomas, thanks so much for a really engaging talk. Following up on some of the bleak outlooks that you highlighted in your talk, I guess I have a very simple question. Given that carbon pricing is a non-starter, given that technology transfer has kind of fallen off the conversation table entirely, should developing countries just focus on adaptation at this stage, because that's where they are going to bear the brunt of the damages that are coming?
Did you ever play the game of Monopoly? Is that popular in India? Yeah. Well, you could either save a lot of money, so you have a stock of money, so then you pay when your thing comes to other people's hotels, or you can invest your money in hotels. And I think in Monopoly, the best strategy is always to invest in Monopoly. I think I don't know. There's some gut feeling I have that we got to stop this thing. We got to stop climate change. The changes are so big. Now, abatement is important, but so the whole of low-lying areas in Bangladesh, how are they going to prepare? I had a Bangladesh student who was working for a thesis on, and she showed me. I said, "Where is this on the map?" And I said, "Oh well, that is going to disappear anyway." And she looked at me, and I could see in her gaze that I shouldn't have said that. I mean, there's not only her family, but there's a few million other people there, and it's sort of unimaginable. How are you going to start preparing for this? It's giving up, and it's going to be depressingly hard, and it's very hard to know what to do with abatement. I think that low-income countries should be doing what they can to abate, and then they should be shouting at the rich countries, which are doing most of the emissions, to abate. They should be pushing they should be the ones pushing the climate negotiations, because they're going to, generally speaking, well, it's not necessarily always true, but generally speaking, the poorest countries are going to lose the most. Partly because they're already warm, and partly because they won't be able to pay very well for Holland will, for a long time, build walls against the sea, and they're quite successful at that. They'll be more successful at it than Bangladesh, anyway.
I mean, part of the reason the Dutch have been better is that they're much richer.
Yeah.
They have far more resources to throw into it.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think, speaking from a rich country as a massive consumer, I think my recommendation would be to just get rich and damn the consequences in carbon warming, because if you're not going to be able to deal with it, most of the damage has been done already. Your oil tanker metaphor. India's increment is going to be relatively marginal compared to all the damage that has been done in the rich countries. But if they're richer, they can cope.
I'm not sure I agree with that, actually.
Not cope well.
You remind me of the fact that where I went to school in central London will disappear, which is, sometimes I feel of some revenge. I think that if India did build all the coal power plants it's going to build and start eating meat and a few other things, the contribution would be sizable compared even to aggregate. I mean, China's emissions are already really sizable compared to aggregate world emissions. And there's a very big difference between 2 degrees and 4 degrees. 2 degrees is a sort of a manageable disaster. It is indeed sizable cost. We will, and that is already done, as you say. 4 degrees, we have no idea how bad it will be. But then we seriously enter the very uncharted territory. So that could be very bad for everyone.
I don't think your school in London. I mean, I'd be surprised if your school in London will disappear. They will build. Britain is rich enough to defend itself against sea level. I suspect. Given the time.
Well,
It'll abandon some places, but
you will abandon some
the British
places.
will not drown under the sea. They will spend the money to make sure that doesn't happen. Being rich is a great help.
It is indeed. It is.
Nowadays with the AIDS, who paid the price of AIDS? Rich countries.
No, although having HIV is still a sad thing, even in a rich country.
Yeah.
You survive, but your life is still kind of ruined. Yeah, being rich is good, but we have to. I think we can. It is possible to become rich, to build houses, to have clothes and food, and supply even mobility and other modern things with solar power, and it's not, luckily, not much more expensive. Well, we need to push the rate at which it is happening, I think.
Thomas, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the impact on Sweden of the tax, because at first glance it looks like an altruistic act. It's a global externality and they're incurring some costs in order to alleviate it to benefit globally. But they've got to raise taxes in some way. If they raise it through taxing carbon, they can reduce taxes elsewhere. There may be some distortionary effects, but they could also, I can imagine, being some positive effects with regard to developing cutting-edge technologies, that it shifts the economy in ways that make it more competitive in some export sectors. So is it really that costly to Sweden?
No.
And if not, then that may be a template for other countries to adopt.
Yeah. So Sweden is known as the place that likes taxes and actually likes equality, and we had a progressive income tax, and then we had growth, inflation, and a few other things, and suddenly we found ourselves with the logic of the public sector being about half the size of the economy, and progressivity in the taxes. We found ourselves with most ordinary people had marginal taxes pushing 80%. And dinner conversations at the houses of richer people, sort of the popular game to brag about your income was to complain that your marginal income tax was 105% compared to the guy to the left who was just 103%. And so there was this sort of, basically our tax system was somewhat broken. Right? So we have a right wing in Sweden too, and their main focus was on getting marginal taxes, income taxes down. We also had wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, and a few other things. They got rid of a whole lot of these things. So it was a big tax reform that was rather regressive. Well, Sweden is still more egalitarian than a lot of other places, but it is much less egalitarian than the 1980s. We lost. From the point of view of the right, we took control back of half our income or something, so marginal taxes went roughly down to about half. Well, a part of one of the things that financed this was a tax on carbon. So that was just part of. It also pleased the environmentalists, and so it was part of a deal. It's a package. You don't do big tax reforms very often. You typically do them once every 50 years or something. They're complicated political processes. And Sweden has no fossil fuel companies. There's no oil, gas, or coal. Sweden, so there were no lobbies, or no strong lobbies. Most of our production is in engineering and efficiency and that kind of thing. We have a car industry. That's true. But they were not strong. There were no really strong lobbyists speaking against the fossil tax. So that's one of the reasons why it was possible. And the fact why they wanted to do it was something else. Is to get rid of some other taxes.
But those are distributional effects. I was wondering, is there a measurable effect on aggregate economic growth, for example?
No.
If not, then it could be a template for the countries.
Yes. So the total tax burden in Sweden has gone down the last 20 years. Quite a lot. So other taxes were lowered more than. Sweden is doing fine. We wouldn't really expect I have a whole lecture on what the effects of, but we use hardly any fossil fuels for heating. That's been one of the main effects. That disappeared. So we use wood. Not only wood, large-scale wood for like firing big combined heat and power stations that provide district heating. We also use this for local. I mean, my farm, for instance, my wife's farm, we make our own wood chips from trees we have to remove from the ditches anyway, and heats the house. It's not very complicated. there's been, the carbon emissions have gone down, and the economy is doing fine. So it really works excellently, this instrument. So their economics works. The trouble is in the political economy of getting the tax in place.
My question was about what you mentioned about the concept of fairness and how US would never opt for a policy where it has to incur a greater cost as compared to India, if that were the only situation. So what do you think, like even in the arena where we are deciding unfairly, how would US policy get rolling with that in mind? And also the fact, since you mentioned that Copenhagen and Paris both failed, what do you see the implications were this climate policy be enacted in the US? How could this overarchingly affect the international policy arena with respect to climate change?
I mean, it's a constant struggle. We were rather close. The Waxman-Markey bill that would have given the US a cap-and-trade scheme at just before Copenhagen, that was so close to passing. They were literally, spending day and night, my friends at EDF, with a number of senators, and there were a number who were, almost, and in the end, there was like 1 or 2 votes missing, and it failed. Had that passed, then the whole negotiation in Copenhagen would have looked different. Probably, I still think Copenhagen was, I don't know if it was still very optimistic to think that plan would have worked in Copenhagen. But, then with Obama, again, we were kind of close. The Clean Power Plan and the climate policies Obama enacted without Congress, largely through presidential order, were also quite radical. And now they're being repealed. But the force of technology is still there, right? That a lot of even Republican states are building, like Texas is building an enormous amount of wind power and solar power. It's popular, right? They still have their guns and their cows and steaks and their hamburgers and their oil wells, but they have solar power and wind power too. Right? So the force of technology is still there. It isn't enough, but it gives some hope. I still think that the poor countries should be shouting louder at the rich countries and using this in other arenas, and always reminding that that these effects are going to be unbearable here. That's why, really, I think that a big problem is some countries, I don't think that would apply so much to India, but a lot of countries in Africa, I don't think they have enough of the research, science, and training so that the general public and policymakers really realize how bad climate change is going to be. So I think the capacity building there is pretty important.
Okay, so that's the end of this session. Welcome you all to high tea, and you can, of course, talk to Thomas during the course of the day. Thank you very much.
I feel so much at home in India, just the idea of having high tea.